That afternoon, the Skyline Harbor food court was packed. In the middle of the open space, giant screens looped the slogan New Horizon Era. Rows of self serve kiosks lined both sides where employees scanned their phones for lunch, while a small delivery robot weaved between tables balancing cups of coffee. The hiss of the espresso machines blended with chatter, hurried footsteps, and the clink of utensils, forming the familiar rhythm of a workplace that doubled as both a co working hub and a data center. But today, something felt tighter in the air. Every gaze was fixed on the temporary stage at the center, the one marked with a clean white banner reading Town Hall. New Horizon Era. Ethan Cole was about to speak. I stood near the edge, tablet in hand, waiting for an update from the West Wing sprinkler system while trying to finish a late, simple lunch. Eating standing up wasn't new. Warnings about pipe pressure or fire sensors always came right at noon. I am 39, still wearing my usual simple office blouse, dark slacks, hair pulled back tight. A couple of younger employees walked by and nodded at me with that mix of respect and quiet awe. Someone whispered to their friend that Mara knows every electric line in this building. I never bragged about that, but they were not wrong. 12 years here had turned Skyline into a map I carried in my head. An HR staffer passed by and asked gently how my daughter was doing, saying she had a fever last week. I nodded. Sophia is fine, stronger than I thought. The question pulled a memory out of me, a memory of my father. He was an electrician who used to take me to job sites when I was a kid. Before he died in an accident, he told me something I have never forgotten. You don't need power, you need to understand the system. That line has stayed with me, even now, inside a corporation that has become its own kind of machine. The microphone crackled, snapping me back. Ethan stepped onto the stage with his usual polished confidence, wearing a white rolled sleeve shirt, fitted trousers, and expensive sneakers. He looked like he was walking out of a TED Talk, not a corporate town hall. He opened with all the familiar buzzwords: agile, disruption, pivoting the legacy, optimizing the future by tearing down the past. People nodded politely. A few colleagues near me exchanged exhausted looks. We all knew Ethan's style: big words, thin substance. Then his tone shifted, dropping into something heavier. He started talking about obstacles slowing Skyline's growth, outdated structures, and old ways of thinking that had to go. Nothing struck me as unusual until Ethan paused, looked directly at me, and called out loudly and clearly, Mara Delgado. The room froze. I even heard someone drop a fork. I did not want to step forward, but Ethan pointed at me like he was selecting an outdated item in a warehouse clearance. I walked toward the stage, the white lights hitting my face. He waited until I stopped, then spoke. Each word like a verdict. Your contract is terminated effective immediately. No notice, no further process. Then he smiled, self-satisfied, and added, the new era doesn't need analog keykeepers anymore. I looked at him for a long moment. Something tightened inside me. Not fear, not humiliation. It was the quiet recognition of a circuit wired wrong, the kind you know will blow up, just not when. I set my tablet down. I unhooked the campus keyring from my belt and placed it on the table. I pulled out my master badge and set it down, then the 2 security tokens from my breast pocket. Each item, carefully, deliberately. To him, they were props. To me, they were 12 years of responsibility, of trust, of work that kept this place breathing. I looked at him and said softly, but loud enough for the entire food court to hear, good luck, Nino. None of these opens itself. I wasn't angry. I was stating a fact. Ethan frowned, not fully grasping what I meant. But someone in the crowd understood. I heard a whisper that he just fired the motherboard. A nearby investor stiffened. I could tell they understood Ethan had just touched something he should not have. I picked up my tablet and walked away. With hundreds of eyes on me, I felt neither small nor shamed, not the reaction Ethan wanted. I only felt sorry. Sorry for him, sorry for Skyline. The security gate opened automatically as I approached. I scanned my badge one last time, and the familiar beep stopped me for a second. 12 years of hearing that sound every single day. Today, it felt like a goodbye. I did not look back. I did not need to. I knew Skyline Harbor was still running on dozens of systems carrying my name. And Ethan had no idea that the keys he stripped from me were only the part he could see, just the surface layer of the entire structure I built for this company. I stepped out of the main lobby. The Denver wind hit my face, sharp and cold, waking me up more than any speech inside that town hall. Standing by my car, I looked at the building for a brief second and told myself to keep walking. If you are listening to this story, I want to know where you are hearing it from: your office, your car, or maybe on your lunch break. And if what happened today feels familiar in any way, stay with me. There is more ahead, and I promise you won't want to miss it. I sat in my car for a long time before leaving the Skyline Harbor parking lot. Every sound around me felt blurred, softened, as if the world had dimmed itself down to just the hum of the air conditioner and my own breathing inside the closed space. I reached into my bag and pulled out the binder I always carried, the binder that had become as much a part of my job as my badge. Dark blue cover, the corners slightly worn, a label across the front that reads, Skyline Infrastructure, Legal and Custodial Access Records. A binder I was certain Ethan had never seen and probably did not understand the weight of. I flipped to the first page and saw Raymond Cole's signature. When he still ran Skyline, he never boasted, never used big words, but every decision he made carried responsibility. I remember the day he handed me this binder. Back then, the headquarters was nothing more than an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Walls stained, concrete floors cracked. He and I stood in the middle of that room, surrounded by secondhand equipment from Craigslist that we had to repair ourselves. Raymond spoke, tired but steady. I trust you. Sign here. From today on, you are the custodian of Skyline. At the time, I did not fully understand what that meant. I only knew the job would be harder, deeper. It wasn't until later that I learned custodian did not mean the person holding a ring of physical keys, the way Ethan imagined. A custodian is the person who manages the federal multi-layer authentication tokens, the one responsible for signing documents for the Internal Revenue Service or the General Services Administration, and the only individual authorized to validate with the company's security vendors. In other places, 3 or 4 people might split the work. At Skyline, I was the only name on every approval layer. Raymond trusted me, and for 12 years, I did everything I could to be worthy of that trust. I let out a slow breath and leaned back in my seat. Ethan had taken my metal keys in front of the entire company, but he had no idea the real keys weren't there. They lived inside legal documents, encrypted tokens, and access lists that only a valid custodian could legally touch. My phone buzzed. FaceTime with Luis. I answered, and my brother's face appeared, hair dripping as he had just come off a shift at the fire station. You okay? I heard you had to stand up in front of 100 people. If you are stressed, come to my place tonight. Mom is making tacos. You will feel better after eating. I laughed softly. Luis always thought every problem could be solved with Mom's cooking. Maybe he was not wrong. The call ended, and a message immediately popped up. It was Sophia. Mom, are you coming home early? Is everything okay? I stared at the simple sentence, and my chest loosened. She is 14, old enough to sense something is off, but young enough to still believe things always work out. I texted back that I was fine, that I would be home early. When I set the phone on the seat beside me, I knew that was only half true. I was fine. Skyline was not. I took a deep breath, reopened the binder, and flipped to the vendor list. If I were no longer the custodian, I was legally required to notify them. This wasn't revenge. This was the law. And the law did not care whether Ethan understood it. I called SecureLink, the vendor managing the federal authentication tokens. When they picked up, I spoke slowly and clearly. I am no longer authorized for any Skyline Harbor approvals. Please coordinate with whoever replaces me. There was an unusual silence before the person on the line replied and asked who had been assigned in my place. I paused, then told the truth. I don't know. I am no longer with Skyline. I continued calling the surveillance vendor, the fire suppression contractor, and the company handling infrastructure services. With every call, I repeated the same statement, and every time I received the same stunned silence in return. No one expected Skyline to replace a custodian abruptly. In this industry, a custodian is not a role you drop overnight. It is tied to legal responsibility, and if the chain breaks without proper notice, the entire compliance structure starts to tilt. When the final call ended, I closed the binder and set it on my lap. I had not touched any system. I had not locked access. I had not deleted data or revoked tokens. I had simply done what the law required. I notified them of the truth. I no longer held custodial authority for Skyline. I looked toward the building in the distance, imagining Ethan walking through the halls with the shallow thrill of some victory he thought he had earned. But that victory was hollow. Skyline Harbor had just lost the only person legally authorized to operate its most critical layers. Without a custodian, no contract, no system update, no federal verification could proceed. The real danger was not that I left. The real danger was that they did not know what to do now that I was gone. I started the engine. The car came to life with a low, steady hum. A new chapter had opened for me. And for Skyline, another chapter was beginning too, one I knew without a doubt they were not prepared to face. The next morning, while I was making coffee in the kitchen, my phone began buzzing nonstop from the old Skyline Managers group chat. I was no longer part of that group, but someone had taken screenshots and sent them directly to me. The first image made me sit down. Dozens of employees were crowded at the main building entrance. A red message flashed across the badge scanner screen. No valid custodian for system update. I stared at those words and felt a quiet shock run through me. I had known this would happen, but not this fast. The next two photos showed Ethan at the front of the crowd, trying to scan his own badge. His face was tight with frustration, and the silver CEO badge he was so proud of had already been slammed against the reader, as if force could rewrite code. The machine displayed the same message again. No valid custodian. A senior employee nearby stood with his arms crossed, head tilted as he said something I could guess from the shape of his mouth. Maybe the system has not recognized the new era yet. Someone beside him lowered his head to hide a smile. I set the phone down and exhaled slowly. None of what was happening inside that building surprised me, but the speed of it felt like watching a film cut into fast forward by someone with scissors. Meanwhile, on the sixth floor, Skyline's IT room lit up at full capacity before 6 in the morning. A young engineer sent me a hushed message. Mara, we checked. The root token only has your name. No backup custodian. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. I knew that because Raymond once told me. Skyline's custodian management protocol only allowed one name on record. Not because we wanted it that way, but because federal authentication standards at the time allowed only one legally designated representative. Another message came right after. It was from the head of IT, a man so quiet and precise he rarely sent anything unnecessary. He wrote a single short line: "We cannot create a new account without triggering a federal check." I knew how stressed he must have been typing that. Every custodian-related change had to be transmitted to the federal system, accompanied by an authentication review and 2 layers of approval. Without a valid handover from the previous custodian, the entire process locked itself. There were no exceptions. While it was still wrestling with the avalanche of red alerts across the control panel, the chaos spread to other departments. Payroll reported that the salary system had frozen, unable to perform second-level identity verification. Finance said a wave of contracts waiting for signature had been flagged for a compliance gap. Security cameras in the data center switched into lockdown light because the token had expired, leaving the server room doors half open with a low-level alarm chiming repeatedly, just enough to fray nerves. I was not there, but I could imagine it with painful clarity. The people who used to come to me every time the system hiccuped were now scrambling, and Ethan was undoubtedly refusing to accept that any of this was his doing. A former teammate texted that Ethan had stormed into the IT room, demanding they bypass everything immediately. I could picture his voice rising when he realized no one was obeying. But they could not obey him. A bypass was a federal violation. This was not the kind of malfunction you fix with a few badge scans or a temporary patch. This was a structural failure. Another message from the young engineer popped up. He just yelled, "Does the federal system work for them or for them?" I went silent for a moment. That one sentence said everything about Ethan. He believed these systems were built for him, belonged to him, existed to bend to his will. He did not understand that Skyline was not a personal project. It ran on strict regulations, legal obligations, and frameworks that no company could escape once broken. People like Ethan thought everything was glass walls and simple buttons. But behind each pane of glass were hundreds of wires, dependencies, control nodes, and fail-safes where one wrong connection could bring the whole thing down. When the clock on my car dashboard hit 8, more messages came from former colleagues. Someone in finance sent a picture of a dashboard filled with red errors. A security officer sent an image of a server room door stuck half open with a warning. Custodian verification has expired. Another simply wrote, "Everything is collapsing." I set my phone down and laced my fingers together. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel joy watching an organization I once cared for spiral into crisis. But I was not surprised. Skyline had relied on me for too long, but they never saw it because my work was never in the spotlight. I never asked to be celebrated. I only wish they understood that a large system cannot run if its foundations are treated as afterthoughts. Meanwhile, on the 13th floor, Ethan was still panicking beneath the cascade of alarms from every screen. He watched error after error surface, yet believed the solution was to give more orders. He thought power lived inside the CEO badge around his neck. But that badge could not open doors. It could not authenticate. It could not fix what had already broken. The only person who could do that was the custodian. And that person no longer worked at Skyline. That morning was only the surface of the chaos. What Skyline was about to face would be far larger. I glanced at the clock again and started the car. I no longer belonged to them, but I knew they still had no idea what was truly happening. The first shockwave had arrived, and this was only the beginning. That afternoon, just as I came home after a long morning sitting in my car watching Skyline fall apart, through scattered messages, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, the area code not from Denver. I almost let it ring a few more times, but something made me pick up. A polite but firm voice came through. "Is this Mara Delgado? I am Hannah Pierce, Chief Operations Officer of North Point Estates. We would like to request your consultation." North Point Estates was no stranger to anyone in commercial real estate. They were one of the largest property management groups in the West, owning dozens of high rises, shopping centers, and known especially for operations protocols so strict they bordered on surgical. They never called anyone they had not thoroughly vetted. I straightened my posture, kept my voice steady. "How can I help you?" she answered without hesitation. "We want to meet with you in person. We are very aware that you are the reason Skyline Harbor ran smoothly for so many years." A brief silence pressed against my chest. The acknowledgement, simple but direct, felt like someone had finally turned on the light in a room I had stood in for far too long. Not because I needed praise, but because I did not expect anyone outside Skyline to notice the work Skyline itself had treated as invisible, if not disposable. I agreed to meet them, and that afternoon I sat in a meeting room at North Point Estates, a space so clean and deliberate it felt as if even the air had been arranged with intention. COO Hannah Pierce wore a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back neatly, her gaze steady but never overbearing. She opened her laptop and projected documents I knew by heart onto the wall: security agreements, federal authentication workflows, database upgrade roadmaps, the kind of paperwork that gave people headaches unless they understood every layer. Hannah got straight to the point. Skyline never experienced a major operational failure during your tenure. Everyone knows that. And now that they are falling apart, the real value of your work is unmistakable. We want you to serve as the lead advisor for North Point as we restructure our operations and compliance framework. As I listened, two emotions pulled in opposite directions. Part of me felt relief, finally being evaluated on merit, something Skyline never did. But another part tightened, still tethered to the place I had given more than a decade of my life. I looked down and realized I was absent-mindedly rolling the pen North Point had given me between my fingers. At the end of the meeting, I told her the truth. I need time to think. That evening, while I was preparing dinner, Sophia walked into the kitchen. She still wore her athletic clothes from after-school practice, her ponytail bouncing slightly. "You should take the job." Her voice was gentle but firm. I turned to look at her. Why do you say that? She shrugged, but her eyes were not a child's. Because Skyline never treated you right. Don't let them use you again. I stood still for a few seconds, feeling her words like the quiet squeeze of my father's hand from years ago. She washed her hands and left me standing there with a truth I could no longer deny. While I considered North Point's offer, Skyline continued to spiral. Later that evening, a former colleague sent me a message. A large tech startup had canceled its lease for 12 floors due to compliance risk. Skyline had spent more than 8 months negotiating that deal. Their withdrawal delivered a heavy blow to the revenue forecast. A major investor confronted them directly during an internal call. How could this have happened just 2 days after Ethan announced the new era? I sat on my sofa reading the message, imagining Ethan pacing the hall with tension carved into his face. A company's blind spot never reveals itself at the collapse. It reveals itself in the parts people tried to hide. And I knew Ethan would never admit fault. Predictably, the next day, Skyline's internal network lit up with an announcement. The message was styled like a corporate poster, logo positioned neatly, fonts designed to look authoritative. Ethan wrote, "We are clearing legacy clutter. This is a necessary transformation." Anyone who read it understood what he was implying. He was blaming me for the chaos. I stared at the message and gave a faint, tired smile. I never stopped Skyline from growing. I kept it from falling while people like Ethan changed surface layers and called it innovation. Skyline was not my victim. Skyline was paying the price for what it chose not to value. When I shut my laptop and looked out the window, Denver was lit up, city lights reflecting off the glass facade of Skyline Harbor. The building looked striking and yet strangely distant. That was when I understood the truth. Skyline was not in turmoil because I left. Skyline was in turmoil because they never understood what kept them standing in the first place. And that was when I realized North Point's offer was more than an opportunity. It was an exit. A doorway I never imagined myself walking through, now visible, bright, and waiting. 3 days after the meeting at North Point Estates, I received another call, this time from a number far more familiar. The name Stellar Grid flashed across my screen. I immediately understood why. Stellar Grid was the second largest infrastructure tech group Skyline had ever attempted to partner with, a $180 million collaboration that, if completed, would have been the biggest turning point since Skyline's restructuring. I answered the call. A lawyer from Stellar Grid spoke with a voice polished and precise. "Hello, Ms. Delgado. We are conducting the final compliance review before signing. However, in our documentation, the only custodian of record is you, and we have not received any transfer files." I looked out the window at the late afternoon sunlight leaning across the treetops and responded calmly. "I was terminated from Skyline Harbor. I no longer have the authority to validate anything on their behalf." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a polite thank you. I understood that reaction well. For a multi-hundred-million-dollar deal, the absence of a legal custodian is like noticing a tiny hole in the hull of a ship just as it leaves harbor. Small or not, it will sink everything. 2 hours later, the news erupted across Skyline departments. It began with a short email Stellar Grid sent to the board. 3 simple words: pending custodian verification. No accusations, no dramatic statements. But those words were enough to freeze the entire deal. Someone sent me a screenshot of the internal chat, showing Ethan pacing the 13th floor hallway, one hand clutching his phone, the other waving as if swatting away smoke no one else could see. No one knew what he was saying, but everyone understood exactly what had happened. The board immediately called an emergency meeting. The person who told me was a longtime manager, usually quiet, but this time he wrote one sentence. "Raymond Cole is on his way back." I had to sit down when I saw his name. No one expected him to return, not after stepping away from Skyline to focus on a family venture. But Stellar Grid pausing the deal was enough for him to realize the company was spiraling toward a dead end. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and pieces of information reached me from the people who still kept in touch discreetly. First came the CFO's report, a wall of red warning numbers. Dozens of contracts are stuck at their final checks due to the lack of a legal custodian. Investment funds are questioning whether Skyline was violating federal compliance requirements. A projected 3-month cash flow is now in jeopardy. The stellar grid freeze alone had toppled the financial forecast like a row of dominoes. Next was the legal department's summary. I was told the room grew so tense that no one dared take a sip of water. The chief legal officer presented each page carefully. Among them were emails the legal team had sent Ethan months earlier advising him to prepare a custodian transfer plan in case of personnel changes. All those warnings had been ignored or brushed aside with replies like, later. Not a priority, small issue. A legal analyst had kept every message. When the board read them, the room fell into a long, heavy silence. Worse still were the emails Ethan sent over the past 2 days, trying to shift blame onto other departments. One message accused me of creating an overly complex system and intentionally hiding information to obstruct transfers. But in that same email, he accidentally attached meeting minutes from last year, where legal had asked him to appoint a backup custodian, and he replied, "No need, I can handle it." A senior director in the meeting sent me a single line after reading that attachment. He just ended himself. I held my phone and felt a strange, hard to name emotion. Not satisfied, not pity, just the clarity of a truth finally revealed. Raymond, according to those present, sat silent for a long time. When he spoke, there was no anger, only the disappointment of someone who had trusted the wrong person. "Ethan, why did you ignore all these warnings?" Ethan had no answer. He lowered his head. The confidence and arrogance he showed during the town hall were nowhere in sight. Eventually, every piece pointed to one conclusion. The name responsible for Skyline's collapse was not mine. The only person who destroyed Skyline was Ethan. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because he never understood that a massive system only stands when its foundations are respected. When the meeting ended, the building felt like an afternoon after a storm. No raised voices, no questions. No one mentioned Ethan's new era anymore. Everything he thought was an obstacle had been the very thing holding Skyline up for 12 years. That evening, I turned off my phone and sat at the dinner table with Sophia. She told me stories from school, and I nodded, smiling. She had no idea Skyline Harbor had just lost its biggest deal. But I knew. And I also knew that the moment Ethan grabbed that microphone and declared the old legacy obsolete, the countdown had already begun. I never imagined I would leave Skyline the way I did, and even less imagined I would one day start my own company. But after the Stellar Grid deal collapsed, after watching Skyline exhaust itself trying to repair the damage it had caused, I realized I had nothing left to wait for. I had spent more than a decade building the foundation of an organization that never valued it. It was time to build something that belonged to me. 3 weeks after the incident at Skyline, I signed the lease for a small office on the 5th floor of a West Denver building. It was quiet, bright, and most importantly, close to Sophia's school. My new company was called Delgado Compliance Group. A simple name, nothing flashy, but it reflected exactly what I intended to do. I hung a family photo on the wall, taken when my mother, Luis, and I attended Dia de los Muertos, the year I turned 25. My mother also sent a small cactus from Texas, telling me it was the gentlest kind, with no thorns, blooming only when cared for with honesty. I placed it by the window where the morning sun reached it each day. On my first day in the new office, I sat at my desk, taking in the small but warm space around me. Cream walls, a light wood table, an empty bookshelf. A pleasant stillness. After years of emergency meetings, flashing system alerts, and late-night calls, it felt like I was finally breathing with my own lungs. That afternoon, Hannah Pierce from North Point Estates called again. She sounded like she already knew my decision. "Congratulations, Mara. We would like to be the first client of Delgado Compliance Group." The contract she sent was only 6 pages long, but every clause was clear and respectful. I signed immediately. Not out of haste, but because it was the first time I worked with an organization that saw my value without requiring me to justify it. News of my new company traveled faster than I expected. A week later, I received calls from 3 companies that had once been major clients of Skyline. They did not say the reason outright. They only said they needed an advisor who could ensure their systems operated correctly, avoiding the risks Skyline had just experienced. I knew what they meant, and I did not turn them down, not because I wanted to compete, but because they trusted me. and I did not want to disappoint them. Meanwhile, at Skyline, Ethan had entered a new phase of denial. A former colleague told me that Skyline's lawyers had sent me a letter accusing me of creating a system too difficult to transfer and intentionally withholding documentation that led to the crisis. I read the letter and simply smiled. Every regulation they cited was incorrect because the entire architecture of Skyline's operations had been approved by Ethan himself during his time as chief executive. But before I could respond, Skyline's own legal department had already issued an internal reply. All of these changes were approved by you at the time of implementation. The statement rippled through Skyline like a quiet slap. The ironic part was, I did not have to lift a finger. The decisions Ethan once called simple had circled back to bite him. Cracks in Skyline began to show. One operations director called me late one Thursday afternoon, his voice low as if afraid someone might overhear. Mara, I know you no longer work here, but we have a problem with the authentication system. No one knows how to fix it. I could hear him exhale sharply before continuing. Can you at least point me in the right direction? I sat still for a few seconds. Part of me wanted to help because the people suffering were not the ones who made the decisions, but the ones forced to deal with them. But another part reminded me that I no longer held responsibility for Skyline. I answered clearly, gently, but firmly. I cannot intervene in Skyline's systems anymore, but I can suggest the general process you may want to follow. He thanked me, his voice carrying genuine relief. The next afternoon, I stood by my office window, looking toward the distance. From here, I could see part of Skyline Harbor's glass facade catching the last light of the day. It looked beautiful, like any high-rise built with ambition and money. But to me, it felt hollow, like a polished shell. Inside it were countless gaps I had patched year after year. Now that no one was there to hold them together, they were surfacing, and Skyline had to face them alone. I wondered if Ethan understood what was happening. Probably not. He was too busy blaming the past to accept the truth. Skyline was not collapsing because of me. Skyline was collapsing because they believed they did not need people like me. I glanced at Sophia, sitting in the corner of the office, working on her homework. She looked up and smiled at me. She asked, Mom, are you happy working here? I told her the truth. I feel peaceful. And for the first time in a long time, the answer did not tighten my chest. The evening light fell across the trees outside the window, and I understood. This was not just a new chapter for me. This was a new version of me. Someone who no longer had to stand behind anyone to keep everything running. Someone who could build something of her own. Monday morning arrived, with a gray Denver sky, as if someone had pulled a dim curtain over the city. I was making coffee in my office when my phone began buzzing nonstop. Not clients, not North Point. 3 messages in a row from former Skyline employees, each sending the same image. The logo of the Federal Legal Office is at the top of a notice. One glance at the header told me exactly what had begun. Skyline Harbor was under investigation for suspected backdating of compliance documents. I pulled out my chair, sat down, and opened the image. The notice was concise, written in that unmistakable federal tone. Based on data submitted from partner systems and the federal database, we have identified discrepancies in Skyline Harbor's custodian transfer records. We request original documents and proof of submission dates. No accusations, no theories. But anyone with experience in this field knew. When the federal office asks about timestamps, it means they suspect dates have been altered. I took a sip of coffee and thought of Ethan. Knowing him, I was certain he had asked HR or legal to backdate the paperwork, hoping to cover the custodian gap. But federal authentication systems are not spreadsheets. They never accept manually altered records. About an hour later, I received another message. This time, it was not a screenshot, but a full PDF from a former colleague with a single line. You should look at this. I opened it. The first page was the data center lease Skyline had signed 7 years earlier. Page 3 made me pause. Clause number 9, written plainly. In the event of leadership disruption or unexpected transition, temporary authority to coordinate and transfer infrastructure belongs to the current legal custodian. Signatory, Mara Delgado. I exhaled slowly. I remembered the day I signed it. Skyline had still been small, leasing its data center from another provider. Raymond and I reviewed every line together. When I mentioned the clause felt strict, he shook his head. The stricter, the better. If anything happens later, we need someone who understands the system to keep it running. I signed it without imagining it would become a sword hanging over Skyline 7 years later. The board called an emergency meeting that very afternoon. People inside later described the air in the room as close to bursting. When the legal proponent projected that clause on the screen, the entire board turned toward Ethan. One member asked bluntly, "Why did you fire the legal custodian without consulting the legal department?" Ethan stood up, palms on the glass table, but his voice trembled. "I did not think it mattered that much. It was just a technical role." The answer stunned several people in the room. The IT engineer had warned Ethan. Legal had emailed him repeatedly. And now that the issue had escalated to the federal level, Ethan still believed it was everyone else's fault. He began to unravel. His voice grew sharp and strained, nothing like the staged confidence he displayed at the town hall. I could not follow every detail, but I heard he started blaming every department in turn. HR for not following the procedure, legal for hiding information, IT for not updating quickly enough. He even hinted that Raymond had left behind an outdated system, forcing him to shoulder the burden. The CFO, who had always remained neutral, spoke up for the first time with a firm, cutting tone. "You cannot blame everyone except yourself." The room fell silent. Ethan opened his mouth, but no one wanted to hear more. When the CFO reaches that point, it means the organization's patience has run out. Before the meeting even ended, another shift struck. The media caught the scent. A financial news outlet published an article online. The headline was simple, but enough to shake Skyline further. Skyline Harbor faces compliance concerns. The article was just a summary of publicly known information, but one line noted that several recent contracts had been delayed or paused due to missing custodian verification. That single sentence was enough to send investors into a frenzy, calling nonstop for explanations. That evening, I sat alone in my office, the stillness almost unnerving. Outside the window, Skyline Harbor stood under a deep purple sky. The building looked tall and proud, but I knew it was more unstable than it had ever been. Ethan, who always believed himself untouchable, was beginning to face the truth. The things he dismissed as legacy burden were the very elements protecting Skyline from chaos. And when he cut that foundation away, the entire structure began to tilt exactly as it was destined to. I closed my laptop and took a slow breath. Ethan was standing at the edge of a pit he had dug himself. Not because I left, but because he never understood what had held him up all these years. A system does not collapse in a day. It collapses when the person in charge believes the rules had never applied to him. The meeting that would decide Skyline's fate took place on a morning that did not appear on any schedule. No internal announcement, no email invitation, no prep notes. Those summoned received only a brief message from the board secretary. "Be on the 17th floor at 8. Do not bring your phone." For anyone who had ever worked at Skyline, that instruction alone was enough to reveal how dire the situation had become. When a former colleague told me what happened, I pictured it clearly. A long, quiet hallway. Security guards are posted at both ends. A metal box at the door is collecting phones. And behind the frosted glass, a meeting that could alter the company's entire future. Inside the room, the board sat in a single row at the top. The chief financial officer, the legal lead, and the head of internal audit were present. Raymond Cole sat in the seat most believed he had abandoned for good, his expression unmoved, not softened in the slightest. Ethan entered last, stumbling slightly. His suit was crisp, but his collar crooked, as if he had put it on in a rush. When security closed the door behind him, he turned instinctively, then swallowed hard. There was no way out now. The meeting did not begin with warnings, but with a thick stack of documents placed before the members. Legal stood, adjusted his glasses, and walked through each item. His voice was steady, clear, emotionless, like a miniature courtroom. The first item: confirmation that Skyline had violated federal compliance regulations by failing to execute a proper custodian transfer. A series of documents with questionable timestamps appeared on the screen. The second item: loss of the Stellar Grid deal due to a lack of legal verification. The report detailed the projected quarterly and annual revenue impact. The third item, the risk of a federal audit, including possible suspension of certain operational privileges if Skyline could not demonstrate transparency. The fourth item, evidence of intentionally disregarded transfer protocols shown through Ethan's emails, his ignored warnings from legal, and the documents he signed without reading the full clauses. When the legal reached the final point, I was told the room went completely silent. No coughs, no scribbling, only the soft hum of the projector. Legal looked directly at Ethan and said, "All of these records carry your signature. We found no evidence that Ms. Delgado impeded the custodian transition. On the contrary, every warning was sent to you months in advance." That should have been the moment Ethan stayed quiet. But the instinct of those who panic is often blind resistance. He shot up from his chair, palms pressed to the table, voice almost exploding. "This is a trap. Mara set me up. She designed the system so I would fail. She wanted Skyline to collapse." No one in the room reacted. Legal flipped another page. "This is the system architecture you approved 4 years ago. This is the email in which you instructed us to reduce backup personnel because you believed it unnecessary. This is the meeting record where you explicitly stated the custodian appointment was low priority. And this is the contract you signed, requiring all changes to be reported 30 days in advance. Every signature belongs to you." Ethan opened his mouth again, but the words stuck in his throat. There was nothing left to argue. Each piece of evidence presented was another layer of earth closing the space beneath him, leaving him with nowhere to stand. But the harshest blow did not come from legal. It came from the one person Ethan believed would defend him: Raymond Cole. Raymond rose slowly, one hand steadying himself on the table. He looked at Ethan not with anger, but with the deep, heavy disappointment of a father confronted with the one thing he never wanted to witness. Raymond said, "You did not lose to Mara. You lost to your own nature. You thought she was the shadow holding you back. But she was the one keeping everything upright, and you pushed her out without understanding the consequences." No one dared breathe. Ethan lowered his head, his hands clenched but trembling. For the first time since becoming chief executive, he had no comeback, no slogan, no shiny new strategy, no TED Talk confidence to hide behind. Only the truth stands in front of him. The board began voting. No debate, no negotiation, no chance of reversal. Their decision was made in minutes. Ethan was stripped of all chief executive authority, all operational control, and all signing power. He was placed under internal investigation for his involvement in compliance violations and attempted backdating. When the decision was read aloud, Ethan did not lift his head. He stared at his hands. And that was when I was told they noticed his fingers shaking. Not from anger, not from indignation, but because, for the first time, Ethan understood something he had never once considered. What was collapsing was not Skyline. It was the image of himself he had spent years constructing. A week after the meeting on the 17th floor that sealed Skyline's fate, I decided to return to Skyline Harbor. Not for revenge, not to see how they were scrambling, but to do something. I should have done it the first day I walked out of that building. Close the old door with my own hands, in the most literal way. Denver's morning was strangely clear, the sky a soft blue, as if trying to calm the chaos of the past days. I parked in the visitor lot, not the employee lot where I had parked for 12 years. Walking through the main lobby felt like walking through my own memories with the eyes of someone entirely new. The touchscreens were still lit, the LED waterfall still shimmered from the ceiling. The delivery robots still rolled by as if nothing had changed. But this place no longer belonged to me, and in a strange way, that made me feel lighter. The new receptionist looked at me uncertainly. She must have started barely a week ago, still untouched by the pressure that lived in the walls. I approached the counter, opened my bag, and placed 2 keys on the metal tray. One old campus key, already deactivated. One security token, now nothing more than an empty piece of plastic. They lay there like forgotten relics. The receptionist opened her mouth as if to ask something, but I smiled first. I am here to pick up new keys, for a new life. There was nothing else to add. I turned away and walked out, calm and steady, without looking back. The glass doors closed behind me with no familiar beep from the scanner, a sound I had heard every day for 12 years. I walked across the parking lot, sunlight streaking across the pavement. For the first time, Skyline held no strings on me. From a distance, I could still see a glimmer of light from the executive floor windows. Former coworkers said Skyline had begun signing contracts with 3 outside compliance firms to patch the holes spreading through the system. They had to. Federal authorities had ordered monthly reports for the next 6 months. Others told me Ethan had vanished from the building the day the board meeting ended. No one knew where he went. Some whispered he had been suspended at home. Others said internal legal counsel was monitoring him closely to prepare his statements. But most people simply stayed silent. Everyone understood that silence was the full stop at the end of Ethan's era. That afternoon, I returned to my office at Delgado Compliance Group. The small but warm space was starting to gain its own pulse. 2 new contracts waited on my desk. A tech company in Boulder and a private healthcare firm had both decided to sign long-term. I read every page, made careful notes, and signed them. Working on my own terms with clarity, responsibility, and none of the empty slogans made each breath feel easier. As I was gathering the papers, my office door swung open. Luis, my brother, stepped in with a bag of steaming tamales. He glanced around and let out a whistle. "Not bad, sis. You managed to bring down an entire company without touching a single screwdriver." I laughed. He always had a way of turning something heavy into a joke at exactly the right moment. I said, "I did not bring anything down. I simply stopped fixing it." Luis laughed louder, and that is the scariest part. Later, Sophia arrived after school. She dropped her backpack and wrapped her arms around me from behind. "You did the right thing." Her voice was soft, but certain. I touched her cheek, feeling that familiar warmth only a mother understands. She looked at me with a seriousness far beyond her years. "You do not have to fight them anymore. You just have to live your life." I smiled, quiet but deep, and answered, "Not revenge, justice. And justice does not need to shout, it only needs to be right." As the sun lowered, I stood by the window. From here, I could still see Skyline Harbor in the distance, the evening light draping over its glass like golden silk. Beautiful, but hollow. Standing there, I felt an unexpected peace. No anger, no regret, no lingering weight, only one truth. I had stepped out, and I had stepped out in the right direction. I closed my notebook, turned off the office lights, and gathered my things. Before locking the door, I looked once more at the small space filled with hope. Some might call it a modest beginning, but to me, it was a new door. A door I chose myself, unlocked myself, and stepped through without needing anyone's permission. And then, a clear voice formed in my mind, sharp and final, like a period at the end of a long sentence. He humiliated me in front of everyone, but the very keys I handed him ended his career.